I came home from my daughter's wedding weekend feeling full. You know, that kind of exhausted happiness where your cheeks still hurt from smiling and your suit still smells like champagne and barbecue smoke. And I pulled into my driveway and just froze. My backyard looked like a crime scene. 3 oak trees, not decorative landscaping trees, not something you pick up at Home Depot. I'm talking about 3 110-year-old white oaks that had been there longer than my house, longer than the paved road out front, were gone. Not trimmed, not managed, gone. Stumps, sawdust, tire tracks in the grass like someone had dragged a body out. And the crazy part? For a second, I genuinely thought I'd walked into the wrong yard. That's how different it looked without them. Those trees framed everything. My porch, the slope of the valley behind the house, the golden hour light that filtered through every summer evening. They were the reason we bought this place in the first place. My wife used to call them the cathedral. And now the cathedral was plywood and mulch. I didn't need long to know who did it. Directly uphill from me, perched like a glass spaceship that crash-landed into a 1920s neighborhood, sat my neighbor's house. A steel and glass monument to ego owned by Dr. Elise Marlowe, cosmetic surgeon, self-described visionary, and the only person I know who says the phrase curated living environment without irony. 2 years ago, she bulldozed a historic craftsman to build that place. Said she was modernizing the skyline. Installed imported Italian marble, a rooftop lounge that technically violated height zoning, and most recently, an infinity pool that looked straight over the valley. Well, it would have looked straight over the valley if my trees weren't in the way. For months, she'd been circling the subject. Casual comments at the mailbox. "Those oaks cast such dramatic shadows," she'd say, smiling that tight smile. "They really block the western sightline." She even offered to cover the cost of professional canopy reduction, which is rich person language for "let me butcher your trees politely." I told her no every single time. Calmly, firmly. Those trees weren't just mine. They were registered as heritage growth through a conservation overlay our hillside has had since the 70s. She'd tilt her head like I was being emotional. "It's just vegetation." "No, Elise. It's 110 years of ecosystem." So when I saw the stumps, I didn't call the police first. I walked uphill. She was exactly where you'd expect, reclining beside her brand new pool, oversized sunglasses, white linen cover-up, holding a green juice like she was starring in a lifestyle ad. And behind her, the view. Wide open. My valley. My sky. I didn't yell at first. I just stood there. She lowered her glasses slowly, looked at me over the rim. "Oh good. You're back," she said, like we had a dinner reservation. "What did you do?" She actually sighed. "Your trees were structurally compromised. I had an arborist evaluate them. They were diseased, leaning, and frankly, dangerous. I expedited removal for safety." "You're welcome. You're welcome." I felt that one physically. "You cut down 3 protected heritage oaks while I was out of town." She waved her hand. "Emergency permit. Completely legal. I filed with the city forestry department. And here's the thing." She had paperwork. Copies. Stamped. An emergency hazard declaration claiming root instability and fungal decay. It looked official. But I know those trees. I've had them inspected before. They were solid. Healthy. No lean. No disease. Her arborist, which I later learned was a guy whose business address was a UPS store, had declared them an imminent risk. Convenient timing, right? I left before I said something I couldn't take back. I called the city the second I got home. And yes, there was a filing. Emergency hazard removal. Fast-tracked approval. It would take weeks to formally challenge. Weeks. Meanwhile, my yard looked like a lumber yard clearance sale. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at old photos. My kids building tree houses, my wife hanging lanterns from those branches, autumn leaves blanketing the grass like some Hallmark movie backdrop. And beneath the anger was something uglier. The realization that she thought she could do this because she assumed I wouldn't fight back. That I'd grumble and move on. Because she had lawyers. Because she had money. Because she believed proximity equals power. But here's the part she didn't know. My aunt, Dr. Helen Whitaker, was a botanist. Back in the 1970s, she helped push through the environmental designation that put our entire hillside under protected urban forest status. I grew up hearing about soil maps and bird migration corridors at Thanksgiving. I didn't pay much attention back then. Wish I had. Around midnight, I drove to my garage storage unit and dug out her old file boxes. Conservation surveys. wildlife habitat studies, original easement documents. And buried in those yellowing pages was something Elise definitely hadn't considered. Those oaks weren't just heritage aesthetic features. They were classified as critical habitat support for two protected migratory species and a state-listed bat colony that nested seasonally in mature oak canopy. You can trim a tree. You cannot destroy protected habitat without federal review. And suddenly this wasn't about neighborhood drama. It wasn't about a view. It was about federal law. I didn't sleep that night. I photographed everything at sunrise. The stumps, the disturbed soil, the crushed undergrowth, fragments of nesting material scattered in sawdust like confetti from a funeral. I measured trunk diameters, documented coordinates, cross-referenced her permit timeline with seasonal nesting schedules. By Sunday afternoon, I had a digital folder so organized it would have made my aunt proud. And Monday morning, I made some calls she wasn't expecting. Because if she wanted to play this like it was landscaping, I was about to treat it like environmental destruction. All right, let's pause the movie for a second, because this is where people usually misunderstand how these neighborhood wars actually work. According to standard procedure, when someone claims a tree is hazardous, especially a large one near property lines, the city doesn't send a SWAT team. They rely on documentation, a certified arborist report, photos, risk assessment, and if it's marked imminent danger, it can get expedited. That's the loophole. Emergency status compresses time. And in legal disputes, time is leverage. The faster something irreversible happens, the harder it is to undo. From a legal perspective, though, local permits don't override federal protections. If land falls under a conservation easement or provides habitat for protected species, removal isn't just a zoning issue. It can trigger federal environmental statutes. That means agencies outside the HOA, outside the city, sometimes outside the state. And those agencies do not care about your infinity pool aesthetic. Now let's talk psychology for a minute. This is a psychological trap affluent neighbors fall into all the time. When someone's used to controlling outcomes, their business, their staff, their curated environment, they start believing rules are flexible suggestions, especially if they've won small battles before. Elise had already been zoning with her rooftop deck. She'd already demolished a historic home and faced minimal consequences. Success reinforces entitlement. She didn't think she was taking a risk. She thought she was solving a nuisance. And that miscalculation, that's where the real story turns. Monday morning, I didn't call the HOA. I didn't call the city again. I went bigger. I filed formal complaints with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, and yes, the EPA. Not dramatic emails either. Structured submissions. Attachments. Habitat maps. Seasonal nesting data. Before and after photos with timestamps. I referenced the original conservation easement language my aunt helped draft in 1974. I cited species protection codes. I wasn't angry when I wrote them. I was methodical. There's a different kind of power in that. By Wednesday, 2 white government SUVs were parked on our street. You want to see panic in real time? Watch a neighbor who thinks they're untouchable step outside in designer sunglasses and realize the people walking up her driveway are carrying federal credentials. Elise came out mid-call, still in scrubs, irritation written all over her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked one of the agents, like this was a scheduling error. "Yes, ma'am," he said evenly. "We're conducting a site assessment regarding reported destruction of protected habitat." She actually laughed. "That's absurd. The trees were diseased. I had a permit." And here's the moment, the tiny flicker, when she realized this wasn't city code enforcement. This wasn't a zoning board meeting she could charm. These were biologists measuring stump diameters and soil disruption patterns. These were investigators taking samples, photographing root systems, requesting her contractor invoices. They asked for the arborist's certification. Silence. Turns out Mr. UPS store had an expired license. From a distance, I watched the shift happen, that confident posture tightening, her jaw setting. She kept repeating, "This is harassment." It wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation widened. And this is where it escalated beyond anything I expected. Because once federal agencies start looking at land designated under conservation overlay, they don't just glance at one violation. They review the entire property footprint. Pool excavation permits, hardscaping expansion, imported non-native landscaping, grading changes on a protected slope. Every modification she'd made during her 2-year resort transformation got audited. And guess what they found? Her infinity pool had been cut partially into a mapped root protection zone. The retaining wall altered natural runoff patterns feeding the lower woodland corridor. The imported palm species she'd planted displaced native understory vegetation essential for migratory ground nesting birds. It wasn't one violation. It was a cascade. I'll never forget the day the official notice was posted on her front door. Bright yellow. Impossible to ignore. Temporary environmental compliance order. Construction freeze. Mandatory restoration review. She stormed down to my yard that afternoon. No sunglasses this time. You did this, she hissed. No, I said calmly. You did. She tried intimidation first. Threatened to sue me for defamation. Then pivoted to negotiation. We can settle this privately. That one almost made me laugh. Settlement doesn't work when federal agencies are involved. You can't Venmo your way out of habitat destruction. By the end of the month, the findings were finalized. The oak removal had indeed destroyed documented nesting sites during protected season. Soil compaction from heavy equipment damaged adjacent habitat buffer zones. Her emergency permit was deemed improperly granted based on falsified arborist documentation. The penalties came in layers. Civil fine, $200,000. Mandatory full habitat restoration under agency supervision. Removal of the infinity pool structure due to encroachment into protected zone. Replanting of approved native canopy trees at specific maturity ratings. 5-year environmental monitoring with quarterly inspections. And the kicker, her property was flagged under permanent conservation compliance review, meaning any future modification required pre-approval. I'll be honest. When the excavators came back to tear out that infinity pool, the same pool that cost her more than my entire kitchen remodel, I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched. Not smiling, not celebrating, just steady. Concrete cracked, glass tiles shattered, water drained out like the air leaving a balloon. That unobstructed valley view she sacrificed everything for? It now overlooked a fenced restoration site with erosion blankets and government signage. My trees couldn't be brought back. That part never stopped stinging. But federal mitigation funds covered the planting of 3 advanced growth native oaks and additional understory restoration on my property. Environmental protections for our hillside were strengthened, clarified language, stricter review triggers. Ironically, local realtors started mentioning federally protected woodland adjacency as a premium selling point. My property value ticked upward. Hers did the opposite. Buyers don't like regulatory handcuffs. They don't like quarterly inspections. They definitely don't like ongoing restoration obligations that can cost tens of thousands annually. Within 6 months, the glass spaceship went up for sale. It sat and sat. Price cuts followed. Eventually, she offloaded it at a significant loss to a developer who specializes in compliance-heavy properties. Last I heard, she moved into a downtown penthouse where the only trees in sight are decorative ficus in the lobby. And here's the strange part. I never felt triumphant. I felt resolved. She thought this was about a better view. It was about control. And control met a boundary it couldn't bulldoze. Part 4. The takeaway. So what's the lesson here? Besides, don't mess with old trees. Because honestly, this was never really about landscaping. The lesson here is about escalation, about ego, about how small acts of entitlement can snowball into life-altering consequences when someone assumes rules bend for them. And I want to talk about that for a minute. Not like a lawyer, not like an environmental activist, just like a neighbor who learned the hard way how these dynamics play out. First, understand this. In most residential conflicts, especially in HOA or conservation communities, the loudest person in the room isn't always the most powerful. The person who understands the framework is. There's a difference. Elise believed proximity and wealth equaled authority. She thought because she had secured one permit, because she had lawyers on retainer, because she had previously pushed zoning boundaries without disaster, that she understood the board. She understood one layer of it. She didn't understand the layers beneath. From a legal perspective, property ownership is never absolute. It's conditional. It's a bundle of rights tied together with restrictions, environmental overlays, easements, municipal codes, state protections, federal statutes. When you buy into certain neighborhoods, especially historic or conservation-designated areas, you're buying into stewardship whether you like it or not. You're not just purchasing land, you're inheriting obligations. And here's where it gets psychological again. This is a psychological trap people fall into when they've been rewarded for pushing limits before. Each successful shortcut reinforces the belief that consequences are theoretical. You test a boundary, nothing happens. You test a bigger one, still nothing. Eventually, you stop seeing risk entirely. That's how entitlement hardens. But systems have thresholds. Environmental law, in particular, moves slowly until it doesn't. Once federal review activates, momentum shifts fast. There's no HOA negotiation circle. There's no private mediation. There's compliance. And compliance doesn't care about aesthetics or status. The second takeaway, documentation is power. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was prepared. Photos, dates, conservation records, species data. That's what changed the trajectory. According to standard procedure, agencies act on evidence, not emotion. If I had just ranted at City Hall, nothing would have happened. So if you ever find yourself in a property dispute, slow down. Gather facts. Understand jurisdiction. Ask who actually has authority. A city permit does not cancel federal law. HOA approval does not override environmental designation. Layers matter. And maybe the biggest lesson, choose your battles wisely. If Elise had come to me honestly, not with manipulation, not with fabricated hazard claims, maybe we could have discussed selective pruning or mitigation planting. Maybe there was compromise somewhere in there. But once trust is broken, especially through deception, you don't get negotiation anymore. You get consequences. Now I want to flip this to you. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who assumed they could outmuscle the system? Have you ever been on the other side, convinced you were justified, only to realize you misjudged the bigger picture? I'm genuinely curious because these conflicts are more common than people admit, especially in affluent or regulated communities. Drop your experience in the comments. And if you take anything from this story, let it be this: stewardship isn't weakness. Knowing the rules isn't petty. And protecting something that took a century to grow is never an overreaction. 3 trees were cut down for a better view. In the end, the view changed anyway, just not in the way she expected. If this story made you think, hit subscribe. I've got more real-world breakdowns where neighborhood drama meets legal reality. And trust me, the psychology behind these conflicts is always deeper than it looks.